The night I handed my husband of 34 years a set of legal documents at our own anniversary dinner. In front of his colleagues, our neighbors, and the woman he'd been hiding for 2 years. I was wearing the same blue dress I'd worn to our daughter's graduation. I remember thinking that was fitting. That dress had seen the best day of my life. It may as well witness the last day of a lie. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because you need to understand what kind of woman I was before that night. You need to understand just how long I had been making myself small. My name is Beverly. Not the Beverly from any story you've heard before, but a 63-year-old retired schoolteacher from Burlington, Ontario, who spent the better part of 4 decades believing that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping a marriage. I raised 2 children, managed a household, marked 1,000 report cards at the kitchen table after dinner, and told myself every single morning that this was enough. That I was enough. That we were enough. My husband Roland was a civil engineer. Quiet, methodical, careful with numbers, and, as it turned out, careful about hiding things too. We met at a church social in 1989 when I was 29 and he was 32. He had kind eyes back then, or at least I thought they were kind. Maybe I just wanted them to be. He proposed 8 months later on the front porch of my parents' house in Ancaster, and my mother cried and my father shook his hand, and I thought, this is it, this is the rest of my life. And for a long time, it was good. Not perfect. No marriage is, but genuinely good. We built something real together. Our son, Gregory, was born in 1992. Our daughter, Annette, in 1995. We bought a house on Sherwood Avenue with a backyard that backed onto a park, and Roland and I planted a vegetable garden every spring that neither of us was any good at maintaining past June. We laughed about that every year. We had inside jokes. We had a life. The shift was so gradual. I didn't recognize it as a shift at all. I thought it was just the natural settling that happens in long marriages. Roland started working later. He started taking his phone into the bathroom. He stopped asking about my day the way he used to. That small, sincere, how was it? That used to come every evening over dinner. I told myself he was tired. I told myself we were both tired. I was 58 years old and retirement was approaching, and I thought, we'll have more time soon. When things slow down, we'll find our way back to each other. I was wrong. I found out about her by accident. The way you always find out about these things, never in some dramatic confrontation, always in the most mundane and humiliating way possible. A Tuesday afternoon in November, I was looking for the car insurance documents in Roland's desk at home because mine had expired and I needed to renew it. He'd always kept the file folders organized. 3rd drawer on the left. I opened it, found the insurance papers, and then my hand caught on something beneath them. A folded card, one of those small gift shop cards with a watercolor design on the front. I should have put it back. I know that's what I should have done, but something in me, some quiet animal part of me that had been paying attention even when my mind wasn't, already knew. Her name was Diane. No last name on the card, just Diane. She wrote that she missed him, that she was counting down the days until his next trip to Ottawa, that she couldn't stop thinking about the weekend in Kingston. I stood at that desk for what felt like a very long time. Then I put the card back exactly where I found it, took the insurance papers, closed the drawer, and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink. I need you to understand something about who I am. I am not a woman who falls apart easily. Teaching grade 7 for 30 years will do that to you. You develop a certain composure in the face of chaos. But that afternoon, I felt something break loose inside me. Not the loud, crashing kind of breaking. The quiet kind. The kind where something ancient and load-bearing just gives way. And you feel the whole structure of yourself shift. I didn't confront Roland that night. I didn't confront him the night after, or the week after. I'm sure some people will say that was weakness. I have heard from a few of those people. But it wasn't weakness. It was strategy, and it was grief. And it was a 60-year-old woman needing time to think clearly before she did something she couldn't undo. I told exactly one person. My closest friend, a woman named Abigail Forsyth, who had known me since we were student teachers sharing an apartment in Hamilton in 1984. Abigail came over on a Saturday morning, sat across from me at that same kitchen table, and listened to everything. Then she said, "Beverly, What do you need? Not, what are you going to do? Not, how could he? Not, I never trusted him. Just, what do you need? I said I needed a lawyer. The first appointment I made was with a family law solicitor named Patricia Dunmore, whose office was in downtown Burlington. I went on a Wednesday while Roland was at work. I told Patricia everything I knew and everything I suspected, and she told me exactly where I stood. We talked for 2 hours. I drove home and made a chicken and rice casserole for dinner and watched the news with my husband and said nothing. I began keeping notes. Not obsessive, not vindictive, just careful. Dates he came home late. Trips to Ottawa that seemed to multiply. A weekend conference in Kingston that he mentioned and then seemed to want to forget he'd mentioned. I documented what I could. I moved a modest amount of money. Money I had legitimately earned and saved, into an account in my own name only. Patricia had advised me to do this. I wasn't stealing. I was protecting myself. There is a difference. Our son Gregory knew. I realized that sometime in January, when he came home for a visit, and I caught him looking at me with an expression I can only describe as guilty. He was 31 years old, a project manager living in Mississauga, and he had eyes exactly like his father's, which I had always considered a blessing, and which I was suddenly finding very difficult to look at. I didn't confront him either. I watched. I noticed that he avoided certain conversations, that he seemed to know without being told, not to ask me about Roland's work trips. He knew, and he had chosen not to tell me. That hurt in a way that was almost worse than the original wound, because Roland had always been at some emotional distance from me. I could trace the years in which the distance had grown. But Gregory was my child. I had driven him to hockey practice at 6 a.m. I had sat with him through a broken arm and 2 bouts of bronchitis, and a terrible year in grade 9, when his best friend moved away, and he didn't know how to talk about how much that hurt. I had loved him without condition or reservation his entire life, and he had looked at me over dinner and passed the breadbasket and said nothing. I kept going. I planted my garden that April. I called my sister in Victoria twice a week. I graded nothing. I was retired, but I volunteered at the school library on Thursday afternoons, shelving books, helping kids find things. I kept myself steady. I kept myself whole. The anniversary dinner was Roland's idea. 34 years. He suggested we have a small gathering, nothing extravagant, maybe 40 or 50 people. His house and garden. A caterer he'd found through someone at work. He seemed, if anything, unusually enthusiastic about it. I agreed, and I made arrangements, and I spent 6 weeks organizing the event in the way I have always organized things, thoroughly and without complaint. In the weeks leading up to the party, I completed everything Patricia and I had been working on. The papers were ready. The accounts were separated. The lease on a small apartment in Waterdown was signed. First and last month's deposit, paid from my own account. I had told no one except Abigail, who had helped me quietly move a carful of things I cared about. Books, my grandmother's china, a box of photographs. Into the new apartment on a Thursday, while Roland was at a site meeting in Oakville. The night of the party was a Saturday in late June. The garden looked beautiful. I'll give it that. The caterer had set up white lights along the fence and lanterns down the center of the long table. It was warm, and the air smelled like the neighbors' rose bushes, and for a moment when I walked out the back door I felt something that I can only call grief. A real aching grief for the life I had believed I was living in that house. The guests arrived. Friends we'd known for 20 years, Roland's colleagues, my former teaching partner June, who had driven up from St. Catharines. People who knew us as a couple, who had watched us raise children and celebrate milestones, and be, as far as anyone could tell, a solid and enduring partnership. Diane arrived at 7:15. Roland had introduced her to 2 of his colleagues before I even registered she was there. I saw her from across the garden, and I knew immediately. Not from any dramatic telltale sign, but from the way Roland stood differently when he was near her. That small reorganization of a person's posture around someone they've been trying not to think about all evening. She was younger than me by perhaps 15 years. She was wearing a pale yellow dress, and she held her wine glass with both hands, and she smiled with the easy confidence of someone who had been told repeatedly that she had won. I watched my husband stand next to her, at my garden party, at the anniversary party he had suggested, and I had organized, and I felt the last remaining question answer itself. This was not a mistake he had made and wanted to correct. This was a choice he had made and intended to keep making. I watched Gregory notice me noticing, and I watched him look away. I went inside on the pretense of checking on the dessert trays. Patricia's envelope was where I had placed it 3 days earlier, in the inside pocket of the jacket hanging in the front hall closet. I took it. I went to the bathroom and stood at the sink and looked at myself in the mirror for a moment. 63 years old, blue dress, pearl earrings my mother had left me. And I said quietly to my own reflection, "You are ready." I went back outside. Roland had moved to the small raised area at the far end of the garden. We'd always called it the stage, though it was really just a slightly elevated patio section with a better view of the yard. And he was saying something to the group gathered around him, looking comfortable. Looking like a man at his own party. I walked toward him. The conversation around me quieted in the way conversations do when people sense something is happening, but aren't sure yet what it is. I was calm. I want to be very clear about that. I was not shaking. I was not crying. I was not performing any of the emotions I had spent the past 7 months feeling in private. I had spent those 7 months so that I would not have to perform them in public. I stopped in front of Roland. I said, at a volume sufficient for the people nearest us to hear clearly, 34 years is a long time to share a life with someone. I hope yours brings you whatever you're looking for. And I placed the envelope in his hand. For a moment he didn't understand what he was holding. I watched the comprehension arrive in his face the way a storm arrives. Distantly at first, then all at once. He said my name. Just my name, 1 syllable, almost a question. I said, "Everything is in order. Patricia Dunmore's contact information is on the first page." Then I walked back through the house, picked up the overnight bag I had placed in the front hall closet 3 days prior, walked out the front door, and got into the car. Abigail was waiting in at the end of the driveway. She had a thermos of tea and a box of shortbread from the bakery on Brant Street, and she didn't say a word until we were on the QEW heading toward Waterdown. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly for a moment before I answered. "Like someone who just put down something very heavy," I said, "and I'm only now realizing how long I've been carrying it." I stayed at Abigail's that night. The apartment in Waterdown was ready, but I didn't want to be alone, and Abigail had already made up the guest room and bought extra milk and the good tea. We stayed up until almost midnight talking, really talking, the way I hadn't talked to anyone in years. Because I had spent so long being careful, so long holding things steady, that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply say what was true. Gregory called the next morning. I let it go to voicemail. His message was halting and genuinely distressed, and somewhere in the middle of it he said he should have told me. And he was sorry, and he hadn't known how. I listened to it 3 times. Then I set the phone down and looked out Abigail's kitchen window at the maple tree in the backyard, and I let myself feel what I felt about it, which was complicated and sad and not resolved. I called him back 2 weeks later when I was ready. We talked for an hour. It was hard. It remains unfinished in the way that things between a mother and an adult child, who has made a painful choice, are usually unfinished. Slowly, and with effort on both sides. My daughter, Annette, called the Sunday after the party. She lived in Calgary and had not been at the gathering, and she had heard from Gregory. Her message was 9 minutes long and contained, somewhere in the middle, the sentence, "Mum, you were the most dignified person in that whole story. And I want you to know I am so proud of you." I had to listen to that part 3 times too, but for entirely different reasons. The apartment in Waterdown was small and bright, and smelled a little like fresh paint when I first moved in. I hung my grandmother's china on the open shelving in the kitchen, and put the photographs on the bookshelf, and bought a new plant for the window. A peace lily, which struck me as either appropriate or heavy-handed, and I chose to find it funny. I went for walks along the trail that ran behind the building every morning. I cooked things I had always wanted to cook, and Roland had never liked. I called my sister in Victoria more often. I started going to a book club at the Waterdown Library on Tuesday evenings, and I liked it enough that I eventually offered to help coordinate the children's reading program on Saturday mornings. People ask me sometimes, friends, acquaintances. Someone at a dinner party who has heard some version of the story. Whether I regret how I did it, whether I should have been more private, whether it was too much, I tell them this. Roland brought his other relationship into my home, my garden, my anniversary celebration. He made a very public choice. I responded to it publicly. I am not ashamed of that. I spent 34 years being discreet on behalf of a man who was not being discreet on my behalf. I am finished being discreet about things that are not my fault. What I do not feel is bitterness. I want to say that clearly, because people expect it and it is not there. Bitterness is heavy. I have already told you I put down something heavy. I am not picking up something else. What I feel, most mornings, walking along that trail with a thermos of tea and the geese making their usual noise at the water's edge, is something I can only call lightness. Not happiness exactly. That is a larger project, and I am working on it, but a clean, uncomplicated sense of being entirely, simply myself. I am 63 years old. I am a retired teacher. I live in a small, bright apartment with good shelving and a peace lily on the windowsill, and a book club on Tuesday evenings. I know who I am. That took longer than it should have. But I have it now, and no one is going to take it from me again.